part of what makes African descended people who would become Black so hated, why they're at the bottom, is because they're associated either as being animals or as beast-like. And this is not a metaphor. It's not that they thought these humans were like animals. It's that they thought that people that looked like me never made it out of the animal kingdom, literally.
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, you know, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Hello, Nekeisha.
Hey, Mariah, how are you?
Good. So everyone, this is Nekeisha Alayna Alexis, and she is an educator, an independent scholar. She does intercultural competence and undoing racism work, and considers herself a liberationist. I met Nekeisha through the seminary, Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. And so I reached out to her and asked what her bad topic would be. And many ideas, which was awesome. At one point she said, well, we could talk about race, veganism, and anarchy. And I was like, yeah, great. And so we kind of honed that into talking about interspecies intersectionality. So before we go in real fast, I want to introduce our drinks. So I have, I saved the thing because I'm drinking tea today. Normally I'm drinking coffee, but I'm drinking Stash Organics. I don't know much about this brand, but it's organic sunny dandelion root tea. So, and I've got a little biker on my mug, and it looks like it's brown. It's got some mountains on it. So.
Very nice, very nice.
What are you drinking today, Nekeisha?
Well, I am drinking IASO Gentle Cleanse Detox Tea, you know, which sometimes it's good to be bad and sometimes you've got to get bad stuff out of you. So,
Hello, beloved baddies. A quick break to tell you that this episode is sponsored by the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul, a nonprofit that supports and amplifies the voices of edgewalkers through art that catalyzes change, laughter that brings us together, and soul awakening to the creative spark within us. The support from the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul has meant the world to this podcast, so I highly encourage you to check out their website, arthumorandsoul.com, to see their other featured artists and projects. If you want to support the podcast, you can check out our Patreon or get in touch. Now I'll let you get back to this episode of Called to Be Bad. We often start with definitions, have a shared language for the episode. So how do you define interspecies intersectionality?
yeah. I mean, I think one of the ways to talk about it is that if people are familiar with the concept of intersectionality and coined by Kimberly Crenshaw to describe the ways that oppression affects different social marginalized groups, the ways that policies, practices, structures come together to impact certain communities in different types of ways. Particularly, she was working with Black women first and has since expanded the term. Intersectionality is still a very anthropocentric way of talking about oppression, right? Like it is concentrated on humans, it's concentrated on particular types of humans. And what I am really interested in is the way that other animals themselves can actually be oppressed, can actually have policies, practices, structures that that harm them, and also the intricate kind of relationship between the animality, the way that we assign certain groups into animal spaces. And because we think that we can treat animals a particular way, um, human beings who are animalized then suffer the same kind of treatment. So it's a double way of talking about both. Can we not be so anthropocentric in the way we think about intersectionality, and naming that there are actually historical, social, other kinds of realities that really we ought to be paying attention to the place of other animals within our society because it affects the way that we treat humans as well, right?
Mhm.
So that's an introduction to it, I
Yeah.
would say.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was just talking to my friend, talking a little bit about what we were going to talk about today, and I realized that there's so many ways that we use language and put downs that put down both humans and at the expense of animals, or the other way around. So like a lot of insults are like, you look like a pig, you're a dog, you look like a cow, I look, and often I hear women doing it to themselves. I look like it, like my mom would always, sorry mom, she'd always say like, oh, I look like a drowned rat. And that is
Mm-hmm.
not only like putting rats down, but it's like violent, or yeah, just different phrases we use that are violent towards animals. um so it's kind of this interspecies intersectionality, um is getting at some very ingrained parts to our language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
do you want
Mm-hmm.
to speak on
Yeah.
that at all?
Yeah. I remember, well, first of all, brilliant, like interspecies intersectionality, I think as I'm using it is helping to name something that is already happening.
Mm,
Um, and I really have to give credit to Carol J. Adams for raising that very point. She has a book called The Sexual Politics of Meat,
oh,
that I was, after becoming vegan, shortly thereafter, another seminary student, MBS student, Brianne Donaldson, she let me borrow that book. I think I might still have that copy. I don't know if I ever bought my own. um, but that's precisely what she talks about is the ways in which really visually and in terms of language, also in terms of the way we enact particular kinds of violence, especially around female bodies.
mm,
And I say female bodies and not women because if we think about the animals that become quote unquote meat, or the animals that are really subjected within our social spaces, it's predominantly female animals, right? You don't have milk without doing something to a mother, right? You don't have eggs. Eggs. I have eggs. You have eggs. like um, uh, eggs are a reproductive part of a female being.
mhm,
Um, and so it's not only that, and this is why the intersectionality part makes sense too. Um, there are ways in which racial language, in which gendered language um, is often animalized language. And the only reason why those metaphors work is because we, the collective we, accept that animals are deserving of certain kinds of treatment. It
mm,
wouldn't be a bad thing to be a cow, except that cows are widespreadly um, demonized or deemed unvaluable within a lot of our collective consciousness. Not everywhere, certainly within Western societies. So, yeah, that the label of interspecies intersectionality is trying to lift that up. That this is not just a human problem.
right. Yeah, I'm thinking about how it's interesting that we do that to our language, because at least um, in Western society that has like domesticated dogs, we treat dogs like or a lot of people treat dogs like family, and yet still dog is used as an insult. Like it's just, it's like
Mm-hmm.
cognitive dissonance, or it like that insult touches at our fear of being animal-like or our
Mm-hmm.
animalistic selves. So yeah, I was also thinking about how you're talking a little bit about the reproductive control, and I think in one of your papers, you talk about reproductive tyranny and
Mm-hmm.
how we control the reproductive systems of other animals, which is interesting that doesn't come up, in kind of our pro-choice rhetoric. And I was thinking about it. So I own chickens,
Mm-hmm.
and I think my chickens have a great life. Here's the how of caring for chickens. But I realized, so chickens can go broody, meaning their body is telling them it's time to hatch eggs. But because we
Mm-hmm.
don't have a rooster, the eggs will just rot. And so
Mm.
the hens will try all their might to hatch these eggs, but it'll be like they end up plucking out their feathers, they lose weight.
Oh gosh.
And so it's more kind to the hen to kind of break them of their broodiness. But it's so uncomfortable that I have to like go in and prevent her from sitting on the nest, and really is just pulling her off her nest, making sure I collect the eggs on time. And after a couple of days, she kind of snapped out of it and realized, okay, I don't need to hatch eggs. But there was one time where she was like, I closed the door so she couldn't get into the nest.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like pacing in front because her body was telling her that her eggs are in there and they need to be laid on. And I was like, even like in humane, well, I think that it's a humane way to raise chickens. It's still control over these animals. Uh,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that was a tangent or if that was relevant, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is because I think, so one of the articles that I think this might be the one that you're referring to, I talk about, it's called There's Something About the Blood. And I look particularly at the sort of conscious omnivore, I'm a happy animal farming discourse. And yeah, sure, if your standard is factory farming, of course, right? Like there are few things that are as gnarly. Well, fishing probably is a close tie, because what we do in the oceans is also atrocious. But if your comparison is, haha, look at the worst possible thing that you could do to humans, animals, and the planet. Well, then sure, like happy farming, happy throat slitting, whatever, seems better. But if the comparison is to what am I doing to this other creature's body? Like this is behavior I would rebel against in any other context, except that I have said that this particular kind of body is not deserving um, of liberation from that kind of control.
Autonomy
Um,
almost.
yeah, that kind of self-determination or autonomy. Um, and this is not to say that humans and animals are the same. Right, like chicken needs are different than women's needs, right? Like cow needs are different from human, right? Like I'm not trying to make an equation there, but in the world of the chicken herself, she's actually displaying to you, this is a need that I have.
Mm-hmm.
And you are preventing that bodily need for what end,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like to be able to attain a food or a type of nutrition that you can, particularly within a Western middle class context, receive elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of for me, the, and this is a strong word, but the sadisticness of the humane kind of movement is that it is this weird sort of dual cognition around you're a person, I see you, you're an individual, you will disappear after I kill you, and none of that is good enough for me to withhold my violence.
Right. Right. Yeah, you were talking with the conscious omnivoreism, how the whole idea is to kind of know your animals, feel compassion, feel bad about the fact that you're killing them, not doing it mindlessly. And the
Mm-hmm.
question is, does that make it better that you get attached to the animal? You're like, I see you, we're bonded, we have this relationship, and now I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to end it. Um,
Right.
yeah,
Violently. I'm going
violent.
to end you. It's not even I'm going to end the relationship. I'm going to destroy you.
Yeah.
Um, so there's the the thing about factory farming, and this is not a advocacy for it. It is coherent.
Mm,
The animal is a thing, is a thing, is a thing, is a thing, is a thing at every stage of, right. At least that's the goal of the system, is to try to not see at all the personhood of the other being anywhere. And so it it is a closed kind of thought loop. Thing, 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 thing. I don't want to know the gymnastics that has to go on to be person, 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 oh, thing.
yeah.
And thing because I want you to, because I want to and I can.
Right.
You know.
Or it reminds me of like almost kind of like performative allyship. You want to look
Mm-hmm.
like you are a good person with this conscious omnivorism, almost as if it is a way, it is still about your own guilt and how you appear as a person rather than about actually liberating the animal or the person, like with performative allyship,
Mm-hmm.
to kind of connect it to race. You care more
Right.
about appearing as a good ally than actually doing the work. Does that connection make
Mm-hmm.
sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about it before, but I can see that. Like, it's almost like I just want to be let out of the cage.
Mm,
And you're doing everything. You're making the cage nicer. You're making the cage. I just want to live. Like, can I? Is living an option in this equation? Like, no. Okay. Open spaces. But the one thing that, or one of the major things that would really upset the whole balance is to actually choose a different type of understanding of who who this being is, or who I am, and to do everything else except what is actually required for change is part of how that connection, I think, the connection that you're making.
right. The power dynamic is still intact. You're
That's
still
right.
treating this person or other animal as if they are lesser, even if you're doing it in a nice way.
Mm-hmm.
It
Right.
reminds me, I watched this TikTok today, and it was Chelsea Handler who was going and doing I think it was a documentary on racism, I think, and it was
Okay.
a snippet. And she went up to these folks and she was talking about slavery, and the man was saying, "Well, I think the bad stories get told more than the good. Why would this person?" And he made the comparison to a tractor. Why
Wow.
would the
Wow.
slaveholder essentially treat their tractor poorly, because it's working the field for them? So why would you do that? And just the cognitive dissonance of trying to like paint this like pretty picture of slavery and not even realizing that you are referring to people, to bodies, as
Right.
inanimate objects that are a source of consumerism, that are doing work, that are products basically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
uh, yeah, and this desire to change the narrative of the how people were treated versus saying, let's actually have people, like, have equity, like liberate people so that
Yes.
I'm getting worked
Yeah.
up and I'm skipping all of our questions, so we're just diving in.
Yeah.
I hope that's okay.
And this too is where the interspecies intersectionality really comes in, also because two things are worth saying here. Again, not that slaves and other animals are exactly the same in terms of what they experience, or certainly into, right, like we're all animals, but animals are different, right? A cheetah is not a dog, is not a human. um, but the logic that of supremacy, the logic of supremacy, I think, deploys itself in very similar ways against different kinds of communities.
Mm.
So in terms of even the history of race, which I do some work around as I'm helping people to think about what white supremacy and resisting race really is about. One of there were lots of things that kind of yeah, intrigued me and sort of shocked me as I was reading for another article that I've written called Race, Racism, and the Nation State. And I was reading translations of kind of original thinkers, people writing in the 1800s and the 17, just like lots of resources. It was interesting to me reading all of these sources, how much the animal world was the reference for people trying to build racial logic.
Oh.
So part of why, for example, quote unquote, races shouldn't mix is because look at mules, right? Like we see this in nature. And since we believe that there are 5 or 6 different species of races, right? Like we should not cross. We will go extinct if we cross. So people are trying to make sense of this new world that they're creating, and they're basing it on their interpretations of other types of animals. So that was one thing that I noticed. Um, the other thing that I say is that race is a species construct.
Mm.
So part of what the argument is, part of what whiteness or Europeans early on, and it becomes whiteness over time, is trying to do. The other end of the spectrum um, is not just blackness; it's animals.
Oh.
Part of what makes African descended people who would become black so so hated, why they're at the bottom, is because they're associated either as being animals or as beast like. And this is not a metaphor. I think this is the place where people get very confused. It's not that they thought these humans were like animals, it's that they thought that people that looked like me never made it out of the animal kingdom, literally. And again, part of why that's such a big problem is that the people who are constructing these theories also had a certain understanding or placement of animals within the world. They were doing so much for the human not to be animal. Um, and so that's why I say white supremacy, and this is a new way of articulating it for me. It's not only anti-black, it's not only anti-brown, it's not only anti-indigenous, it is anti-animal.
Mm.
Fundamentally, because the escape that's trying to happen is to do all this work to prove that we are higher than all of these other creatures. It's a refusal to understand one's own animality as much as it is a rejection of these other kinds of groups.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I don't know how that sounds to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Just I'm realizing even the concept, like I've heard people talk about how you have to like dehumanize someone, in the military, and speaking about police brutality, how they like dehumanize particularly Black and brown people. But just
Mm-hmm.
having that concept of dehumanize implies the hierarchy of humans above animality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
My mind is a bit blown right now. Um, yeah, and when
It's
one of
deep
your talks,
stuff.
yeah, and in one of your talks, you talked about how no, Black and brown people are not being dehumanized. They were never humanized to begin with. Am I saying
Right.
that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 And I thank Claire Jean Kim for that.
Okay.
Just super insightful. Her book is called Dangerous Crossings, race, culture, and species in a multicultural age, or something like that. It's Claire Jean Kim. And, all of the things, reading that passage, all sorts of stuff just started to click for me. Not that I agree, but I understand what's happening.
Mm,
And if I'm able to understand what's happening, I don't get as surprised anymore, right? I understand the logic behind it. How could they leave him in the street like a dog? People said about Michael Brown, for example, because he's not a human within the context of the supremacist place that we live in the afterlife of slavery, in which literally slaves were counted along with the cows and the horses and the property that you could pass on, right? Like, there's another great book called The Dreaded Comparison that so many people take out of context, Lord. So many people. But one of the arguments she made there was that it's the practices of domesticating other animals that people attempted to use on slaves. Why? Because they didn't think that they were human. So, to me, to be talking about, like, I'm super grateful for intersectionality as a concept. I talk about it all the time. This is not to throw shade anywhere. But if we are talking about intersectionality and we're not talking about species, to me, we're missing like some of the bedrock of how we've gotten to where we are. And that's why my liberationist tendencies, my anarchist tendencies, um, the way that I order my life is around liberation for, like, my own personal tagline is liberation for every space body,
mm,
for every body. Um, because if there is a world in which any creature is allowed to be subjugated, where we do the gymnastics such that any person, including other animal persons, are deemed kind of worthwhile of uses of power in particular kinds of ways, we're not ever really going to be able to escape.
mm,
Like, that logic has to disappear in the world that I want to see. Right? Like, we just have these weird ways of judging who's valuable or not based on standards of sameness. Um, but these other beings that have their own worlds and their own interpretations and their own communities, they would be allowed to thrive. I mean, that's not that I read Genesis literally, but in the sort of imagination of who God is, that's exactly what God asks everybody to do: be fruitful and multiply. And nobody's fruitfulness and multiplication comes at the expense of anybody else's.
mm,
Why? Because Dominion says we all eat plants. Dominion does not actually give us the right to eat other animals. If people read scripture, right? Like, everybody's, all the humans are naked. When they're not naked anymore, they grab for fig leaves, not skins or furs. Dominion possibly does not include using other animals as clothing. It doesn't.
Mhm.
Um, there is no farming until sin enters into the world. So the command to have dominion actually does not necessarily entail domesticating anybody. So fruitfulness and multiplication, um, and human dominion still does not come at the expense of anybody else. And I don't know if that's a world that is possible. I would like to believe that it is, that we can get ourselves out of this trap. Um, but it's the one that I try to embody in my own life as much as possible. And it's the one that I intend to work toward for as long as I can.
Right.
So, like there are lots of, we can do all sorts of things with the Bible, right? And still be faithful. And to me, it's kind of like, okay, why do we want death so much? That's the deeper question. Like, why are we, that's why the name of my article is There's Something About the Blood. If you want to kill something, kill asparagus. You want to kill something, kill carrots. What is it about blood that we are so fascinated by? What is it about blood that makes certain kinds of death legitimate? Like, what is it about blood that we cannot seem to get away from? So the article, There's Something About the Blood article, ended up being about plantation romances and narratives around conscious omnivore killing. But really, the one that I hope that I get to write sometime is like, why are we so, there is something about blood specifically. And this is not just a Christian sort of thing. That humankind writ large, I might need to take that back someday, but let's say the collective we are really fascinated by. And anytime somebody says, hey, let's find a way to not bleed one another, there are these very interesting kind of gymnastics that we go through, um, to prevent that. So that's a long explanation. I could do a lot more, but there's rich thinking biblically about the fact that Jesus actually does not take the place of humans on the cross. Jesus is in the place of a lamb or a dove or a goat. He's not in the place of a human. We call Jesus the Lamb of God and don't actually pay attention to what that means.
Right. Well, my mind's blown again. So wow.
Yeah.
Do you have any, you were asking like, what is it about the blood? And I was starting to think of things. Do you have any theories about what is it? Like why there must be blood?
Mm-hmm. I don't. I mean, I'm sure somebody's written about this, but it's a really open question for me. I don't know. What are some thoughts that you have?
Well, I was kind of connecting it to what you were saying about power. And the idea, like in the Bible, in Hebrew scripture, they talk about how the life is in the blood. And that's why there's like prohibitions against drinking blood, because you're like drinking the life of another animal. And so I wonder if there is something about the power of having another being's life in your hands, of taking that life. That, I mean, it sounds really sick, but I mean, so much of this is caught up in power dynamics. Do you want to talk more about and perhaps how that's connected to race?
Yeah. Part of what colonization was an encounter with radical difference that did not make room for that radical difference. If and so the skill set to be able to say, I don't understand what you're saying. I don't understand. I cannot even imagine being in your being. Let's say something as wild as an octopus. I don't understand octopus. I don't know what your world is like. I can't ever live there. I'm never going to understand it. And I respect you anyway enough not to harm you.
Mm.
Think about, for me, as a Black person, as an African descended person, the people who became colonizers, if that was the approach they took to the folks that they encountered, I don't understand you. This is radically different from anything that I know. And I respect whatever you are enough not to harm you. I would like to think the world would be different. And so my practice of doing that with other animals is not separate from the desire that I want for me. You
Mm.
don't have to understand me. You don't have to agree. You can think whatever the fuck you want about who I am. Don't harm me.
Right.
Know enough, choose enough not to harm me. We might be able to figure out the other stuff if we're not at least engaging in the killing of one another.
Yeah. Would you have any final advice for people who are trying, to do this work to break into interspecies intersectionality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think one of it is to become conscious. Um, Language can sometimes be helpful. That's one of the things that we were talking about before we started rolling. I don't, you, meat is not a thing,
Mm.
right? Like, so flesh, you're eating someone's flesh. Let's at least be honest. You're eating a someone. You're likely eating a female someone, right? So I think it just helps to really like be open to interrogating why we do the things that we do. So as a person who is vegan, when people ask me about my veganism, often I will ask back, what's your food way? And when did you choose it? And a lot of times people didn't choose. Um, and so, I think one of the things is to just become open, to become conscious, to interrogate one's language, to change one's language, and to really really do like that kind of initial work to be open to the possibility of other ways of viewing other creatures, of other ways of viewing issues, even the issues that we're talking about, like racism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and uh, I since we're on a podcast about pastors, right? Like, yeah, there's interesting biblical work to be done. It's just boring to be like, well, sacrifices in the Bible. I mean, that's boring. Um, it's boring. Oh, we have dominion. Yeah, read what's happening around dominion. Read Hebrews. Got some interesting things to say about Jesus, right? Like, let's just expand even our consciousness of what the biblical text is doing. The Bible is complicated. There's lots of things that it's advocating that we don't advocate now, right? Like, we can faithfully, scripturally, do some other things around other animals, right? Like, literally, our earth home depends on it. So if there's ever a time to start being interesting and creative, this would be a very good time.
I'm curious. I do hear a lot of pushback against veganism and being vegetarian, saying that it's kind of dismissing it because
Mhm.
it's like a privilege to be able to choose to um, eat vegan or eat vegetarian. How do you respond to
Mhm.
that line of thinking?
First of all, it's just an ignorant way of understand. Like, in a lot of other places, animal bodies are reserved for feasting.
Mm.
It is a distinctly Western thing to have 3 or 4 different type of dead animal bodies on one sandwich. Let's not, folks. Like, like other other parts of the world are heavily plant-based.
Mm.
Are they vegan? No. Some places are. Um, heavily plant-based. So let's wait. That's one of those tropes that just has to be retired. There's a really good book called Sister Vegan by with Black women vegans writing about some of this, and they talk about the kind of mostly plant-based nature of other indigenous cultures around the world. People need to do history.
Mm.
You do not have cattle, quote unquote, farming in this thing we call the US without colonization.
Mm.
Indigenous people are removed off of their lands for what? Not swimming pools, not patios, farming of other animals.
Mm.
Some of the contests between indigenous people and colonizers were around we're creating places for our animals. If we really want to get deep, the eating of cows within this context is a colonization holdover.
Mm.
So, it's just like the more that you really wrestle with this stuff, it gets really sticky. It gets really, really sticky. It's very similar in other parts of the world too. So I was at a animal conference in Mexico City where one of the animal liberation groups that's there is actually indigenous based because the eating of certain kinds of domesticated animals were brought over from Spain. It's a taking of like plant based is more of their indigenous way of being. So they don't even call it veganism, right? They look at it as a return to indigenous ways of eating and being because all of this access to the animals that are there is a byproduct of colonization. So, there would be, that veganism is not a white thing. Animal liberation is not a white thing. There would be a lot of other types of people who are having intersectional ways of thinking about why they're doing what they're doing. Um, so, privilege, meat is as cheap as it is because subsidies are poured into these industries. It's often historically been a rich food. Um, so there's just lots of ways of unpacking some of this stuff. And really it's because our imagination is so limited by what we think about other animals
Yeah.
that we're not able to really investigate these other ways either in our tradition or other traditions or history or whatever, right? Like we have already decided that other animals are subject to us and creatures that can die and precisely creatures that we can kill. And so that's the kind of a priori, that's the foundation that we're working with. So of course that's what we're going to be focused on. The minute I opened up and sort of said like other animals are persons,
Mm.
I feel comfortable with that language. It doesn't diminish me in any way, shape, or form for me to admit that I'm a person and this other being is a person. I like the whole world kind of changed. So, people, but the openness has to be there.
Right. Yeah. Well, my mind has been blown several times during this conversation. And it excites me to learn more. I want to read everything that you've written, and I don't know if we can share somehow the articles that you've written or some other stuff, but we'll try to link some of that.
Sure, yeah. Mhm.
Do you have any other final thoughts before we end with a blessing?
No, that's it. Thank you, everybody. Liberation for everybody. Let's do that as much as we can in this world while we can.
Well, that was a perfect blessing. I don't even know that I need to add anything. May you, Nekeisha, and everybody listening and watching, may you go in this spirit of liberation. May you be held as a person with worth. May you look to other animals with that worth and empower and liberate everybody. I feel like I just repeated everything you just said, but
Thank you. I appreciate it.
yeah, thank you, Nekeisha, for being on. It's been wonderful. So, and we'll see everybody next
Thank
time.
you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Of course. All right. Bye, everybody. That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.